What's up, y'all? Welcome to week 7, I believe this is going to be. So this recording will be associated with the Monday of the week after next. Today is the 29th of September. Today is a Wednesday. So I think this will be in association with the 11th of October because I think the last time I did one of these, it was the 6th of October, and that would have been a Wednesday, and then 5 days hence. Yeah, so this is the 11th. So I just got to keep track of all this in my mind. I'm trying to get as far ahead of the material as possible because in a week and a half's time, I'm heading up to my family's cottage with my on-again, off-again girlfriend, and we're going to have some quality time together. And so I told her I got to get through this stuff so we can have that time when I don't have to worry about actually making these recordings while I'm up there because the environment really isn't suitable for it. And it's always a good thing to know that you got that behind you as opposed to it ahead of you. So anyways, that's why I'm going to be publishing this stuff in as far advance time as I can. Now, I got a couple of administrative points I want to make before I actually delve into the substance of what I'm going to talk about today, which, by the way, does concern Napoleon. I'm going to close escrow on the Napoleonic era and the Napoleonic Wars. I realized a couple of things, actually, when I was reflecting upon what I had to say today and how quickly I have to say it, because I did promise, and I know I've been consistently promising and yet delaying the fulfillment of that promise for the last couple of weeks now with respect to representing to you that I'm going to cut back on the time and not actually take an hour 53 minutes of your time, which is to say that I'm going to make a more concerted effort henceforth, at least for this next week, which is going to be week 7, to try to reduce this down to maybe an hour and 15 minutes, maybe an hour and 20. Perhaps we'll even go just over an hour today. I don't know. It really depends on how quickly I can get through this stuff, and I'm aspiring to do a very quick and sort of succinct job at this stuff, which I always aspire to do, but it never ends up happening, so we'll see. A couple of points, though. First and foremost, I have to say that I haven't had any constructive feedback from any of you thus far concerning whether or not. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. That's actually not. I shouldn't make categorical statements like that because I did hear back from one of you with respect to any sort of constructive feedback concerning whether or not you actually find this particular modality, i.e., YouTube, to be in furtherance of and conducive to your understanding and assimilation of the material. And I'm constantly curious, and I'm constantly expressing my curiosity towards you guys and soliciting feedback from you concerning whether or not this actually meets with your approval. Now, I know going all the way back to, I don't know, the second week, and we had this discussion, and I solicited your guys' feedback then, and it seemed to be the case that there was almost unanimity in assent for this proposition, this YouTube proposition. But I'm ever mindful of the fact that perhaps the reality doesn't comport with the expectation, in that there may be sort of a deviance from what you actually had anticipated this was going to be and what it actually materialized and sort of came to be. And so if that is in fact the case, and if you find this to be still definedly boring, if you find this to be not really particularly enticing or not in any way in comportment with your expectations or otherwise unsatisfying or unsatisfactory for whatever reasons, you have to let me know, first of all, what those reasons are so that I can try to redress that. But what I anticipate may be the issue, okay, and I can't know because none of you actually told me this, so I'm trying to engage in a bit of mind reading here. But what I anticipate could conceivably be the issue for some of you, anyways, is if in fact it is the case that some amongst you signed up for this course with the reasonable and fair expectation that it was going to be conducted on site in physical person, and then it ends up devolving into this. Well, again, the question I have to ask myself is, if I'm similarly situated to yourself, is, well, what do you lose? What do you lose? What would we have but for the fact that we're doing this via YouTube? What will we have in a physical classroom? Now, I tried to anticipate this when I initially posed the question to you guys about 4 weeks ago, when I tried to set this up as sort of a dichotomy between an interactive, more engaging form of learning versus a more detached, sort of unilateral monologue type form of learning. And maybe that wasn't an entirely fair representation. Maybe that was a bit of a false dichotomy, because the concern that I have is not just the extent to which I am accessible. Now, I don't think that that's a problem, because I constantly admonish you guys to contact me if, in fact, when or ever if you need any help from me. Okay, so that's a standing invitation, and you should feel in no way impeded or hindered from contacting me. One of you, I think I told you guys I had a conversation with one of you guys. It was a very helpful conversation. We spent about 2 hours on the phone. We didn't really talk much about history, but we did talk about a lot of other interesting things. So if any of you guys want to call me, by all means, please do so. If you want to get a hold of me via email, by all means, please do so. If you want to text me, don't do that, because I use a very archaic sort of old school phone, and it's not really conducive to engaging in text because it takes a long time. It's very tedious. So if you do text me, don't actually assume that I may respond. I probably just call you back, or I'll shoot you an email if you do that. But the point I'm trying to make is that I'm accessible. Okay. So if you guys got any questions, concerns, issues that arise in the course of viewing these lectures, or you just want to articulate some concern that you have more generally, by all means, please do so. I won't hold it against you. I'm not the kind of person that would do that. Okay. I really do want to know if you have constructive criticisms, because look, I'm grading your guys' exams right now. As luck would have it, today's the 29th of September. Today's the due date of your first exam, and I already have 3 exams that have been turned into me. I've graded 3 exams. Thus far, for those of you who are interested in these sorts of things, the grades are all over the place, literally. I had 1 student, so out of those 3, I had a very high A, about the highest A you could possibly earn. I had a C that was about the middle echelon of the C area, and then I had a moderately low F. So that's about the distribution that I would expect if, in fact, we were taking this test in person, physically in the class. That's not what I would expect based on what you're actually doing, which is to say that you have not unlimited time, but you have, what, 10 or 12 days, I think, to take this test, and you have nearly unlimited resources. So I'm expecting these grades to be better on the basis of what I think are relatively probative considerations in that time and the abundance of resources as they inform your answers seem to me to suggest that the more of those things you have, the more likely you are able to mitigate the potential for failure. In other words, the greater the probability of you actually achieving some measure of academic success in the context of these exams. The question has to be, with respect to the tests, for those of you who are concerned that, oh, I didn't do as well as I had hoped. Oh, well, this actually isn't working out as well as I thought it was going to work out, this whole YouTube thing. It's not a matter of how much better could I do, but rather how much worse would you do relative to how you've done thus far if, in fact, we were in the physical classroom. That's the dispositive question, and that's the one you have to really consider. Now, it seems to me that you have to actually answer that if you're being intellectually honest with yourself anyways, that if you have less time, which certainly you do, because when we take the test in person, you only have an hour and 53 minutes as opposed to, the better part of 10 days, 12 days, almost 2 weeks, right? And you have less resources available to you. Well, does it stand to reason then when those kinds of constraints are imposed upon you in terms of time and the availability of source material, that therefore that would result in a greater probability of academic success on the test? That seems to me to be counterintuitive in the highest degree. So that's one of the considerations that I really think you guys ought to ponder. And the reason I'm setting this up in the way that I am is because we have to make some decisions. We have to make a couple of decisions. First of all, the more prescient and the more timely decision concerns test number 2. Now, I have to operate in accordance with a particular timetable so as to ensure that we actually get 3 tests in throughout the course of the semester, because you guys expressed your desire for 3 tests as opposed to 2 tests. We took a vote on it. I think it was nearly unanimous, and the majority vote carried the day in favor of 3 tests. So therefore, what I have to do is I have to ensure that I structure things in terms of the curriculum, in terms of how quickly we pace ourselves, in such a way so as to take an exam approximately every month. Now, we're taking the first test at the end of September. That means the second test is going to be right around the end of October. I told you guys originally I was going to be back around the 20th of October, which actually is not accurate because I looked at the date, and I think I told you guys this before. That's a Wednesday. I'm not going to get up the night before so I can get there to teach class on Wednesday morning, because I would be bedraggled and beleaguered and that wouldn't make any sense. So what I'm planning on doing is I'm coming back the end of October, probably that last week. Now, that also happens to coincide with approximately 1 month subsequent to our initial exam, which means that exam number 2 should coincide with that particular week, which will bring us to the 25th and the 27th of October, which is around the time that I'm planning on coming back to the UP. Now, the probative question for you to contemplate, the operative question for you to contemplate is whether or not it is in your interest as a student. And this is all about you guys. It's not about me. It's about you. So you decide on the basis of what you think is in your best interest, not on the basis of whether or not you think I'm going to like what you decide. Okay? Because I can't hold it against you either way. I don't do that. That would be unethical. It would be unbecoming. It would be a repudiation of all the philosophical concepts that I try to abide by as a human being. So I don't care whether you say, Jeff, we would really like to have you come back and physically administer this test to us, proctor this test in the actual classroom, so that we don't have unlimited time, so that we actually don't have the availability of resources, and so that we have to actually use and rely upon exclusively our memory and our retention of the information as we exposed ourselves to it in the course of the last 6 weeks, so as to take that test within an hour and 53 minutes time. You could conceivably vote for that. All right, that's an option. I don't know how enticing or particularly salacious that option happens to be. I personally, right, my own subjective interpretation on this is that that doesn't seem to be a very appealing option if, in fact, you are trying to maximize academic success in the context of this class. Or option number two is we could say, well, it stands to reason that because we've been listening to YouTube videos throughout the duration of October, which will in fact be the case by the time the end of October gets around, well, it stands to reason that therefore we should take an exam which more reasonably lends itself to that particular modality of instruction. E.g., the exam should be precisely consistent with the form of examination that the first test took, and that it shouldn't be a physical in-class test, interpersonal test, because that's not the kind of materials that you're offering us. The kind of materials that you're offering us are materials that are more readily designed to be used in conjunction with taking an online or a take-home test, whatever you want to call it, as opposed to a physical in-class test. Because if you take the physical in-class test and all you have are 25, 30 hours of YouTube lectures. What does that mean? What does that entail? What are the implications? Well, that means that you're going to have to go out there and adequately assimilate yourself to all the most salient and important aspects and concepts contained within those videos, and then come into that classroom, physical classroom, ready to take that test based on your complete lucid comprehension of all the most critical information throughout the vast swath of all those YouTube videos. Now, I can't say this for a fact. I don't know this for a fact because I don't know it I can't know it for certain, but I assume that not all of you are listening to every single bit of all of these videos that I'm putting out there. Maybe that's not a fair assumption to make. Maybe you are. I don't know. But if you are going to take this test in person, then it becomes incumbent upon you to do exactly that, because otherwise you don't know what you're not missing. You don't know what you don't know. And you can't afford to know what you not know what you don't know, because that might be the stuff that's actually important to understanding the test when you actually go to face it. And you only have an hour and 53 minutes to work your way through it. Now that, it seems to me, is in many ways antithetical, right? Strongly opposed to, inimical to your interest, your academic interest in furthering your status as a student in good standing in this class. So that's option two. Option three is you could just say, you know what? I'm going to roll the dice. I don't give a shit either way, Jeff. You're the professor. You're the instructor. It's your prerogative to decide. It's your responsibility to decide on behalf of all of us collectively, because after all, this is a dictatorship. It's not a democracy. Well, yeah, but I'm trying to make this as democratic as possible, and that's the reason why I'm taking up 15 or 20 minutes of the class time, expounding upon and elaborating on these various options, because I want you guys to feel as though you have the power of discretionary control to the extent that you can over how this class, what form this class takes, how the curriculum actually is structured, what we spend time talking about. Now, I can't give you complete unilateral control of that, because I have to serve sort of a moderating function vis-a-vis a lot of that stuff. But as far as the exams are concerned, if you guys want a physical in-person test, that's again, that's your option, that's your prerogative. By all means, let me know. It just seems to me that if I were a student and if I were trying to structure the test in such a way that was really maximally conducive to my academic success, I would rather it be a test which allows me maximum amount of time and maximum availability of resources that I can therefore avail myself of in the process of actually undertaking to answer the exam questions, as opposed to having the strictures of time and having only to rely upon my memory, good as it may actually be. That seems to place considerable impediments upon me to success. So it's up to you guys. Option one, physical test in person around the 25th or the 27th of October. Option two, take-home test, right? Very much analogous to test number one. And that means we probably won't meet that week, because that week will be exclusively dedicated to purposes of allowing you the time to take that test. Or option three, you don't care either way, whatever I decide, but then if I decide something that you don't like, you have to live with it. So that seems to be, as I say, rolling the dice and taking a chance and just hoping I decide in a way that's in your interests. So that's that. The other point I wanted to make, guys, is going back to what I said about 10 minutes ago. The concern that I have, and again, maybe this is an unnatural and unreasonable concern. I don't know because I don't hear from any of you guys. I heard from one of you so far, and that person basically said, Jeff, you're doing a good job on online YouTube videos. You're making it as interesting and engaging as you possibly can. It may not be as theatrical as you at 9 in the morning because I think you probably do a few lines of code before you come to the class. And you're not doing that on the YouTube videos because you're living there with your girlfriend or whatever. Okay, well, for whatever reasons you may have, and maybe some of you have different reasons and different perspective on this, but the feedback that I got thus far seems to confirm that this is working for you. Okay, that's a good thing, right? Will it continue to work to the extent that it has thus far? I don't know. I think there's no reason to believe that it won't. But let's just put it this way: if there's somebody out there who feels as though I'm dispossessing you of some kind of quality that you would have if, in fact, we were actually physically taking this class in person. The only quality that I can anticipate I'm dispossessing you of is, first of all, well, I was going to say the extent to which we can interact, but that's not true because, first of all, you guys are not a very interactive group. Maybe because that's 9 in the morning. I don't know, right? Either way, if we were doing Zoom, we would still have to be at 9 in the morning to accommodate your schedule, so that's a moot point. So it's not about interactivity, all right? That can't be it, right? Or accessibility, shall I say, right? It's certainly not. It's certainly not accessibility. It's important not to conflate these 2 points. But if you think that, well, maybe the surplus value associated with the physical class vis-a-vis the online, whatever. This is not an online class. It's not. Right? YouTube videos are different than an online class. If this was an online class, you guys wouldn't see me. You would hear me, but you wouldn't see me. Okay, you'd be dealing with PowerPoint slides and audio recordings, and that's not very engaging. It's probably less engaging than this. But I think what I'm going to do. All right, let me just give you guys 2 recommendations, and just hear me out. I swear it's going to take 5 more minutes of your time, then I'll move on to something else. The first thing that you could do is you could send me, for those who want to have some kind of constructive dialogue, some kind of discourse, some kind of dialectical exchange with me as your instructor and you as the student, you can do that by sending a group email, right? Sending it to me and then CCing the rest of the class in that email. Right, I've been doing that because that's certainly my prerogative to do that. Well, I have to do that. It's my responsibility to do that because now we're conducting things virtually and through remote distance learning. So I have to do that. I can't not do that. But the point I would make is that for any of you who are interested in actually doing that, that would, to my mind, essentially be a simulacrum, a means of simulating the kind of exchange that you would have in the context of an actual physical classroom, because you'd be expressing you'd be articulating your position, perhaps in rebuttal to something that I said in these lecture videos. Perhaps you're just asserting a particular point that you think is interesting, whatever it happens to be. And then everybody, at least ostensibly everybody in the class, is privy to what you're saying because you're CCing them on the email, so therefore they can read that, right? Now, just as in the classroom environment, if you assert something, if you get up and you vocalize and you say something in response to what I've said, people may hear it, but they don't necessarily listen to it. Okay, they will have to hear what you're saying, but are they listening? Are they really paying attention? Are they assimilating what you're saying? Maybe, maybe not. All right. So I think that this is precisely analogous and symmetrical to the function that talking in class would serve. So for those of you who that might be out there and might be concerned that, oh, I'm dispossessing you of the value of the full educational experience because you don't have the opportunity to actually interface with me directly and discuss things, right? This seems to me to be a proposition which accommodates for those people who are concerned about that being lost in the confines and the constricts of this particular form of instruction. So that's proposition number 1. Proposition number 2. And I've got a wasp flying around here right now, actually, guys, so I may have to cut this short or try to do some battle with him in the midst of this lecture, but it's distracting the hell out of me, and I can't actually continue to do this if he's going to keep flying around. So I may actually cut this really, really short, and this may actually be a part 1 and part 2, and that's why I have my mouse over here and all these kind of contingencies in the back of my mind in case this kind of shit goes down. But point number 2 is this. All right, so this is a video associated with the 11th of October. I am going to propose to you that a week after that, it's going to be Monday, the 18th of October, okay? I'm going to propose a jam session, if you will. Well, maybe not a jam session because there's no guitar and I'm not going to be singing, but it's going to be a session whereby we actually do conduct a Zoom meeting. Okay. Now it's going to be voluntary attendance. All right. It's not mandatory. It's not compulsory. It's completely optional. It's your prerogative to attend or not. All right. I'm not going to drag your asses up out of the bed at 8:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning. It's going to start not at 9 a.m. It's going to start at 10 a.m. Okay. And this is just speculative, all right? This is all tentative. This is all conjectural. Whether or not this actually transpires, again, it's up to you. It's your prerogative. It's your choice. Just be prepared to live with the, well, if it's optional, it doesn't really matter whether or not you choose this. But here's why I'm suggesting this, right? What the function of this? The function of this is going to be an opportunity for you to, number one, engage with me directly. Okay. For those of you who are concerned about losing something associated with this class, losing some kind of ethereal, intrinsic, abstract quality that I can't really articulate because it's difficult to really conceptualize what it might actually entail for you because it's subjective. But for those of you who are concerned about, oh, I'm losing something, right? This is not what I expected it was going to be, right? This is my effort to in some ways offer you a compensatory measure of accommodating for whatever concerns that you may actually have, and perhaps ameliorating those concerns. I don't know, but that's what I'm proposing, right? There's that the possibility. I'm not saying let's do this. I'm not saying it's a good idea. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying it's an idea that I had, right? And so that, number one, it serves the function of giving you the opportunity to interact with me. So that perhaps provides you with some intrinsic value that otherwise wouldn't be conferred by virtue of just listening to YouTube videos. I don't know, right? Perhaps not. Perhaps I'm making a big deal out of nothing. I don't know. The second option, the second thing that it will provide you with is it will offer us an opportunity to discuss in real time the issues concerning the proposition that I just made regarding test number 2. Okay, so if you want to discuss that more further with me, you want to elucidate that matter, if you want me to clarify anything that you have in terms of concerns about that, perhaps that's just so self-explanatory and self-evident and doesn't require actually having a Zoom session and you interacting with me because I already articulated both sides of the case and you can make the decision based on the information that you have right now. Maybe that's the case. I don't know, right? And then the third thing that this will provide you with is an opportunity to, I suppose, for those of you who are interested in doing this, rebutting or challenging anything that I've said thus far, right? Because much of what I've said thus far is hugely interpretive, right? It's not all entirely subjective because it's predicated on objective fact, but a lot of what I say thus far, anyways, throughout the course of the preceding, 4 weeks that I've been doing these YouTube videos, it's mostly subjective. It's me saying, here's what I think about Robespierre. Okay, is he a good guy? Is he an asshole? Is he a smart guy? Well, maybe he's all those things, different things to different people, right? Here's what I think about the trial and the execution of Louis XVI, right? Here's what I think about the import and the significance, the lasting ramifications of the French Revolution. Here's what I think about Napoleon and his efforts to create this false sort of pretentious sense of majesty, right? It's just, here's what I think, right? Now, it happens to be grounded on fact, right? I'm not just pulling this out of my ass and making this up as I go along. I couldn't do that. I wouldn't be very good at my job if I did that. But the point of the matter is that, the fact of the matter is that you are fully, you should I would hope anyways, because you're a college student and I treat you guys with a high degree of intellectual reverence and dignity, precisely because I presuppose that you're all smart enough to be able to make these decisions for yourself as to whether or not you think that's a good argument, whether you think that's utter bullshit. And if you think well, don't say that it's bullshit. Don't call me out on bullshit, because I'm actually not BSing. Right? This is just my particular spin on these things. Whether or not you like it, well, that's up to you. But if you want to challenge some of the assertions that I made, and that's what this class is, it's not what it's all about, but that's part of what it's about, is challenging some of the fundamental points that I make, because I want this to be, as I said, as dialectical as possible, and I understand YouTube doesn't really lend itself to that at all. So I'm coming up in 24 minutes here. I got to shut up because I realize that we are 7 weeks into the semester right now, because we're in the second week of October, and we go until literally the end of November. So that's 4.5, it's 8 weeks, right? So in terms of substance, right? So you exclude 1 week at the end of October because that's going to be our test number 2. You exclude 1 week at the 1st of December because that's going to be test number 3, i.e. the final exam, and you're only left with 14 or 15 weeks of substantive material. I've spent half that time, 50% of that time, covering 2 PowerPoint series, two series of PowerPoint slides. I have 6 PowerPoint slides, series of PowerPoint slides in total. Therefore, I have covered, what's 2 out of 6? Roughly 33% of the material in just over 50% of the time, which means I got to really accelerate the pace with which I'm talking. Now, I don't think I'm talking too slow. I think perhaps I'm talking too fast. So I can't talk any slower. I really have to talk at least as fast as I'm talking. But what I have to do is I have to make a much more concerted effort to sort of tie myself to what I actually have in my notes, because I haven't been looking at my notes very much, and I'm just going off the cuff and being spontaneous and extemporaneous, and that's a good thing because it means that we're keeping it real, as I like to say. But at the end of the day, what really matters is, do we actually cover the material that is associated with this class, and am I doing justice with it in a way that actually includes it, incorporates it in some meaningful way. So I'm going to talk a lot less about abstractions today, ideas and philosophies and things. I'm going to talk a lot more about facts, okay, what Napoleon was actually doing. So I want to begin by just recapitulating one of the final points that I made in the last YouTube video, which is to say that one of the things that Napoleon is trying to do is he's trying to establish a legacy for himself. But the problem that he has is that he doesn't really have any pre-existing legacy. He doesn't have like the value of a family name or a heritage or the inheritance of the right to rule. He doesn't have any of those things. So he has to make a much more ostentatious effort at displaying all the trappings of power and the pomp and the circumstance and the ceremony and all those visual sort of aspects of the actual coronation process. And I think that that's why it took the form that it did. Now, one of the other points that I was making last time, and I want to reiterate here, is that Napoleon is trying to essentially evoke the nostalgia that the French people, that the people of Europe really have, for a unified, singular imperial power which ruled over vastly different people that were scattered throughout the course of Europe. And if you look at what he's trying to make his reign evocative or reminiscent of, he's obviously trying to associate himself as much as possible with the Roman Empire. Okay, if you look at the royal emblem and the royal insignia that Napoleon used. It's this big Roman eagle. It kind of looks like a Nazi eagle, except it doesn't have a swastika underneath it, right? That's a Roman eagle, right? He did that very deliberately. This is an effort of Napoleonic propaganda, and it's a means by which to invoke in the minds and the hearts of his subjects and anyone he aspires to conquer the imagery of Rome. All right, the Rome was a solid, stolid, unified state. It was a geopolitical powerhouse. But it also brought peace and stability and Roman law and Roman justice to parts of the world that didn't really have those things. And so in that way, Napoleon is trying to convey to the people of Europe that the French Empire, under the auspices of Emperor Napoleon, is in many ways reminiscent of that which Rome was vis-a-vis the Mediterranean world 2,000 years before, 1,800 years before he ever came into existence. Now, the other thing he wants people to look at and say, oh, Napoleon reminds me of that, right? And that's what I mean when I say that he's trying to make this his reign and his legacy as evocative of or nostalgic for these previous episodes in history, is that it reminds people of this particular person or this particular empire because he's doing it in this particular way. I think what he does very shrewdly, he uses in the process of being coronated as the emperor of the French people, he uses the Lombard crown. Okay, and I was talking about this last time, and I don't know if I mentioned the significance of it, but the Lombard crown was used by the Holy Roman Emperors. Okay, the Holy Roman Emperors who ruled over vast terrain, vast geographical expanses of Europe, mostly Central Europe, mostly modern-day Germany, but also parts of modern-day France and especially Italy. And he wants this crown to, in many ways, be symbolic of him being the inheritor, the logical inheritor and the successor to the power and the authority and the regnal splendor of the Holy Roman Empires. And he's doing this because, obviously, if you look at the historical trajectory of history, in Europe anyways, you could say that there have been several great emperors, okay? Several great empires, rather. The Roman Empire, which withstood the test of time because it lasted for the better part of almost 500 years. And then that was followed by the Empire of Charlemagne, okay, which was sort of the empire of the Franks. It was a sort of a quasi-empire, but it was successful in consolidating the interests of Christian Europe against the Muslim hordes which were invading Europe at that time. And then finally you have the Holy Roman Empire. And so what I think Napoleon is trying to do is he's trying to he's trying to make the connection. He's trying to get people to connect those dots between, well, first there was the Roman Empire, and that ruled over all the various barbarian peoples in Europe, and that brought light and enlightenment and wisdom and knowledge and literacy and justice and Roman law and all the sorts of things that are stable, conducive to stabilizing the society and ensuring that people live good and fruitful and just and long lives. And then you had the Empire of Charlemagne, right? And he's deliberately cultivating the legacy of Charlemagne by virtue of actually having his coronation, his initial coronation, happen at the same cathedral where Charlemagne had been coronated. Okay, so he wants people to look at that and say, well, Charlemagne was the successor of the Roman Empire, okay, because the Roman Empire came first, then there was the Empire of Charlemagne, and then after that there was this thing called the Holy Roman Empire, right? And the Holy Roman Empire lasted for a very long time, and it did for Europe in the 1300s and the 14 and the 15 and 1600s what the Roman Empire did for Europe way back when, around the turn of the millennium, right? And so Napoleon is basically asserting visually, at least in terms of the theatricality of these ceremonies, that he is the inheritor of these legacies which preceded him and which are legacies associated with empires which ruled over vast expanses of space in Europe. And so he's saying that I am the rightful inheritor of the legacy of Rome as it was carried down through Charlemagne, as it was perpetuated by the Holy Roman Empire. And now as I pick up the baton, right, it's like a relay race, I pick up the baton. In fact, he actually had a baton. It's a scepter, I think is what it's called, right? You got a scepter and you point at people and you get them to do things with the scepter, right? It's like a magic wand, right? Except it actually works, right? You bitches over there, go do this and give me some cognac, right? If you're Napoleon, that's what you'd be saying, right? Or whatever he's saying, okay? Giving orders around and using the scepter to instrumentalize and facilitate those orders. Well, he's very deliberately cultivating this imagery so that it is evocative of this pattern of rule, which itself establishes that he is the successor, the rightful heir of the power and the legacy and the majesty of those great empires which preceded him. And therefore, I think he has to work extra hard, right? I mean, I'm saying he's doing these things as sort of a compensatory effort so as to compensate for the fact that he is painfully aware, he, Napoleon, is painfully aware of the fact that he doesn't have any royal blood. The blood that courses through those veins of Napoleon was barely aristocratic, okay? He was from the minor aristocracy on an island called Corsica, which is really an insignificant place, okay? So he's doing this as a means by which to compensate. Now, one of the last things I talked about, I think, in the last lecture with you guys was how Napoleon began his conquests by going and attacking and defeating the Austrian armies and the combined Austrian and the Russian armies, which were arrayed against him at a place called Austerlitz, which is actually in Czechoslovakia. Okay, it's in Bohemian Moravia, a place between kind of between northern Austria and southeastern Germany. It doesn't really matter where it's at because I'm not going to touch you guys in geography, but this is a significant battle because what it ends up doing is it defeats the armies of Central Europe and gives Napoleon access to control over most of these Central European nations. And either he imposes direct control by way of actually leaving French troops there garrisoned in these various nations, or he achieves control vicariously by appointing various friends and comrades and associates of his as the leading figures, the heads of government, the heads of state of these newly conquered states. And he did that in Sweden, he did that in Naples, he did that in Saxony, right, with his brother, Joseph Napoleon. He appoints this guy king. Okay, the guy's his brother. He's kind of a douchebag, actually. He wasn't nearly as accomplished as Napoleon. But then again, compared to Napoleon, right, just because you're not accomplished compared to the most accomplished person in the world doesn't mean you're not accomplished objectively. It just means you're not accomplished compared relatively speaking. But Joseph Napoleon became the emperor of, it wasn't actually Saxony, I made that up. But it was a place like Saxony. I think it was Westphalia, actually, which is another northern German principality. And then Bernadotte, which is one of his marshals, one of the great high-ranking marshals of the French Napoleonic armies. This guy is appointed by Napoleon to be the king of Sweden. All right, imagine that. Okay, so you can literally, in the French Republican Army, in the French Napoleonic Army, you can go from buck private, right, the guy who's cleaning the toilets, the guy who's swabbing the decks, the guy who's getting down on the guy who's going out there and serving food to the higher ranking officers, right? You can go to that, from that, all the way literally to the highest ranks, the highest general status in the French army, and then go on to become a king of your own country if you have the favor of the emperor, Napoleon, right? So Napoleon, after he conquers much of Central Europe. And as I say, the Battle of Austerlitz is instrumental, right? It instrumentalizes Napoleon's victory over the Central European powers, and then he's able to extend French influence and French power over much of Europe, okay, including Austria, whom he initially allies with, and then the Austrians get a bit insolent, and they get a bit impetuous, and they decide to treasonously betray him and actually declare a war on him, even though they're his allies. If you guys ever play Total War games or any real-time strategy game or turn-based strategy game, you'll know that the AI in those games likes to ally with you, and then they'll pretend to be your friends, and then they actually stab you in the back, and that's something what the Austrians were doing actually in real life at this time in 1806. I think that happened. I don't care about dates, right? I'm just throwing that out there to show you guys that I'm actually paying attention to what's going on in terms of the chronology of all this. So Napoleon becomes the kingmaker, right? He becomes the kingmaker essentially, right? And what that means is it's a reinforcement, it's a validation or a vindication, a confirmation, I suppose, if you will, of his authority, of his regnal authority as emperor vis-a-vis the other European states. Because now, as emperor, what is he doing? He's asserting his imperial prerogative. Right? How's he asserting his imperial prerogative, Jeff? Well, but first of all, conquering other states, conquering and subjugating other states that were previously ruled by heads of state who fancied themselves as kings and queens and princes and dukes and monarchs and etc. Right? And so Napoleon is superior to the other monarchs of Europe by virtue of his ability to conquer them. Okay, so that's real-time, actual physical authority. And then he's also superior more metaphorically, all right, more metaphysically, I suppose you could say. He's also superior, right? Allegorically, because he after vanquishing his various monarchical adversaries, the rulers of Austria, which were the Habsburg dynasty, which were archdukes or kings, right? And then the king of Prussia, who was ein König or ein Kaiser, as they refer to him of Deutsch in German, and then the king of the various princes of the petty German kingdoms and the king of Naples and so on and so forth, right? After he vanquishes these guys, well, then Napoleon has the right, by virtue of conquest, of appointing people who succeed these former monarchs, right? So he literally becomes the arbiter or the adjudicator of who is going to be the next ruler of various lands in Europe. He becomes a very literal kingmaker in the literal sense. So in that sense, in this way, I'm sort of setting up this dichotomy between what is known as de facto authority and then de jure authority, right? And for those of you who don't know anything about the law or don't know anything about Latin or don't know anything about, de jure, de facto authority. De jure authority means authority by law, right? Authority by law, by virtue of law and by virtue of protocol and by virtue of the traditions and the way things are done. And then de facto authority means authority in fact, because I factually actually have the ability to exert my authority, even though I may not have the law on my side, okay? I always give the example of me in the classroom, right? Do I have de jure authority or do I have de facto authority? I used to say I had both, because I used to be a pretty big weightlifter and I used to be massively strong and pretty hulked up. I never did roids, but I was pretty hulked up and I was about, I'm about 6'3" and I was about 220, 230 and I could bench press 350. And I used to say, well, I have de jure authority, right, by virtue of law, because the bylaws of the college give me authority and control over you guys in this classroom, the very narrow strictures of this classroom, right? I have that kind of authority, but do I have de facto authority? And then I say, which of you students thinks you can come up here and kick my ass? And of course, none of them actually raised their hand because they thought I was being serious and they didn't want me to whoop their ass in front of everybody. But of course, I did have de facto authority. Now I don't really have much of either because I'm down here in Detroit and your guys are 600 miles away, and all I have is the authority to talk on a YouTube video, and probably that doesn't really constitute much authority at all. And I'm not going to threaten any of you guys because you can probably go out there and find a way to sue me for doing that. But what kind of authority does Napoleon have? Well, he has, with respect to what he's doing with these kings, these former rulers of various principalities and monarchies across Europe, he has de facto authority in that he has the power to literally conquer these nations and then literally overthrow or determine the fate of, either way, right? It's his prerogative to determine the fate of the ruler who formerly was the sovereign monarch over, X, Y, and Z, Austria, the Netherlands, Germany, various principalities, et cetera, right? So that's de facto authority. And then he has de jure authority, right? Or metaphysical authority or allegorical authority, because now he's assuming the right to appoint his own lieutenants, his own marshals and subordinates, his own brother, for God's sakes, right? Not on the basis of and this is the interesting thing, right? Because you look at the fact that the Napoleonic armies are predicated on the revolutionary model, and you say that, well, it's really a meritocracy, but is the fact that Joseph Napoleon became the king of Naples, is that really merely a facet or a feature or a function of a pure meritocracy? Do you think that had his last name not been Napoleon, he would actually been elevated, promoted to the rank of king, which is really not a rank, it's a status, right? I mean, it sort of supersedes all ranks. Would that really be if his name was just, Joseph, I don't know any French names, Joseph Le Chateau or something, right? If he was just some French guy, would he have been promoted? Even if he was, well, no, probably not. Okay, so Napoleon is in certain ways he's sort of abrogating the principle of meritocracy by elevating people who he personally likes, and therein lies the problem with absolute monarchy, even one that is foreordained or constituted by virtue of the assent of the people, even one that is constituted by virtue of a plebiscite, right? The popular vote. Okay, and the popular vote is, as a reward for the services of the French people and the French state, we, the French people, in our just and circumspect prerogative to decide these matters, confer upon you, Napoleon, by popular vote, the prerogative of imperial rule. But what happens when you become the emperor? Right? Are you constrained? Do you have to abide by principles of meritocracy? Of course you don't. You do whatever the hell you want. That's the whole point, right? Because if you couldn't do whatever the hell you want, there wouldn't be much good in you becoming emperor, right? So that's the catch-22, right? The more you assign power to somebody, even though it's democratically based, even though you went through the electoral process ostensibly, right, so as to sanitize your achievement of power in vis-a-vis the Republican traditions, right? Even though you did all that, you still have the prerogative of violating principles of meritocracy. And you're still going to fall into a system whereby it relies much more on nepotism than anything else. Okay, so I know I told you guys I was going to talk about things, abstract ideas, but I hate to say it, but that's really what higher level history is really all about. It's about sitting here and talking about these things and proceeding dialectically and going back and forth on these various issues. It's not about, oh, this happened here, and then this happened over there, and then this happened there, and so on. Who cares about all that, all right? It's not important. Okay, it's not the kind of stuff that really causes you to think critically, and that's what this class is all about, is critical thinking, okay? But yes, I am going to have to get to this stuff eventually. So, let me turn the page here, guys, and turn the page onto something about, well, we talked about Austerlitz, we talked about the historical significance about Austerlitz. Let's talk about the... let's talk about something called the Continental System. The Continental System. So I've got like 4 or 5 more pages of exclusively Napoleonic War type stuff, and I've only covered, I think, 1.5, and I don't have much time to talk about this stuff because I told you guys I wasn't going to go much more over an hour. So I got half an hour to consolidate 3 or 4 pages into, which is going to be interesting. I might as well just start reading this stuff, but I promise you guys I wouldn't read from slides or papers or anything else. So the Continental System, very, very concisely. The Continental System was a system devised by Napoleon whereby, by virtue of him controlling, physically being in military control, strategic geopolitical control over Central Europe. Okay, so by this time, Napoleon basically controlled all of Europe except for Portugal and Russia. Okay, he can think about that, right? Just think about a map of Europe. And I wish I had my visual aids right now, but for those of you who don't know what Europe looks like, go and Google it and you'll see what it looks like. But what's the problem with what can you do if you control all of Europe except for Russia and Portugal? Well, I guess that depends on what are your objectives, right? What do your objectives entail? Well, by this point, one of the very few holdouts that was still at war with Napoleon and hadn't yet been subjugated by Napoleon was the only European country which could withstand the force of nature that was Napoleon and his conquering abilities as a great strategic mastermind. What European nation do you think would be impervious to the kinds of battlefield assaults that Napoleon was so renowned for destroying his enemies by virtue of? Well, think about the European continent. Think about continental, and then you have non-continental Europe, right? You have extra-continental Europe, okay? Continental Europe is beyond the continent. Well, you have the UK, right? The United Kingdom. You have England, right? Great Britain, okay? And Great Britain was the holdout, right? Great Britain was staunchly opposed to Napoleon because Napoleon, for the same reason that Prussia was actually opposed to Napoleon.
Prussia didn't hate Napoleon because he was anti-monarchical or because he represented the ethos of the French Revolution, right? They didn't really care that much about that. Well, they cared more about that than the British did. But the British and the Prussians were very concerned about Napoleon because he upset the status quo of Europe. He upset the balance of power in Europe. Because traditionally, historically, Europe had always been sort of divided into different camps, different major states. But there was no European superpower. Okay, there were regional powers, right? Austria was a regional power, Russia was a regional power, Prussia was a regional power, and France was a regional power. Okay, and then I guess you could say to a certain greater or lesser extent Spain and maybe Portugal and certain other places. But there were regional powers, okay? And that was a good thing because it maintained the homeostasis in Europe, right? And it ensured that no one nation accrued too much power unto itself because it's a zero-sum game, right? The more power Prussia or France or Russia or whoever gets, well, then the less power these other nations have. And then the more likely that country is going to be able to unilaterally dictate policies to the other nations that haven't yet been conquered by it, and the more favorable the terms and concessions have to be given to that nation which has accrued great power unto itself. And that was what Prussia was really fighting against. That's why they were opposed to the French. Of course, they were also opposed to Napoleon conquering their country and subjugating them and appointing, the king there, right? Which he never actually got the chance to do. He just aligned himself with Prussia on terms that were very favorable to France. But the reason that the British were really concerned about the ascension of Napoleon and the conquest of Napoleon wasn't because they had a fundamental distaste for or were inimical to the idea of this guy who represented imperial power that was under the guise of republican ideals and this sort of mishmash of convoluted ideologies. It wasn't an ideological inhibition they had or an ideological proclivity which they objected to. No, it was merely a matter of expediency. It was a matter of the dictates of geopolitical necessity, which stipulate, all right, this is realpolitik, and this is foreshadowing Otto von Bismarck, we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks if I ever get to it. Realpolitik is just looking at the world and saying, let's be pragmatic. Okay, in terms of how we engage with our adversaries, in terms of how we engage with our allies. And the British were looking at the world and being pragmatic. And they were saying, well, if we allow Napoleon to continue to conquer and to continue to subjugate and to continue to amass greater and greater power and influence into himself by controlling all of Europe, what can he do to us? He can literally ostracize us, we the British, in our little island kingdom, right? What does ostracism mean? Well, ostracism, the literal definition, the technical definition of ostracism, you guys probably don't know this. For those of you who never took an ancient classical course in ancient Greece or ancient Rome, ostracism was actually performed back in ancient Athens, back in the 5th and 4th century BC. And ostracism was a process whereby the high-level officers of the state who were appointed by the citizens of Athens, because it was a very democratic place, would be literally subjected to what was known as an ostracon. So a committee of people would come together and they would vote to ostracize this general or this civil servant or this officer of the state who had failed the Athenians in a certain way, and he was required to remove himself and his person and his property from the boundaries, the precincts of the city of Athens, and then go live out in the wilderness like a hermit out there on the mountain with Sasquatch and whoever, right? And that's what ostracism meant. So Napoleon's plan here, the Continental System, as they referred to it as, I don't know whether or not he referred to it as, but the Continental System, as it was referred to, was essentially a plan by which to ostracize Great Britain, ostracize the British, to isolate them, okay? And how do you isolate the British if you control most, but not all, the ports in continental Europe? Well, what do? You ban trade with the British. And the idea is, if we ban importation and exportation, any sort of import-export businesses, right? You get those down in Miami, you got those all along the East Coast, right? If we shut down all import-exports going to and coming from Great Britain, what do we do? At least in theory, what can we do? Well, the thought is that we will starve out the people of Great Britain, or at least we will economically starve them. And by virtue of dispossessing and disabusing them of their economic sustenance, they won't have the means by which to fund their military supremacy. And you're thinking to yourself, what are you talking about, Jeff? The military supremacy of the British? They're not that hardcore. They just wear those stupid bearskin hats and they got those silly, beards and the goatees, and they're just kind of like a more hardcore version of Canada, which is to say they're not very hardcore at all. Well, at that time, and actually this is still true to a certain extent today, probably less true today than it was in the 1800s, but at that time, the British Navy were the I don't know, Thor's hammer, Poseidon's trident, okay? They were invincible. The British Navy Napoleon was to land-based tactics and land-based military victories, as the British Navy was to ocean-based tactics and sea-based naval victories. So the British Navy was supreme. And the reason, of course, was because most of Great Britain was overseas. If you actually looked at the terrain and the lands that were conquered and controlled by the British, you had all of the Indian subcontinent, which is 20 times the landmass of the Great British Isles. You had many other overseas holdings, and so Napoleon knew he couldn't. In fact, he tried to fight the British Navy. He tried to fight the British Navy at the Battle of Trafalgar. This is a very famous battle. It involved a tremendous victory by the Royal Navy, over the combined fleets of the French Navy as well as the Spanish fleet, because by this time Napoleon had conquered Spain and he had usurped their fleet, their naval power, on his own behalf. And so there was a combined fleet, kind of like the Spanish Armada, right? Remember that? And how that didn't go so well for Spain because the big storm blew up and it destroyed a bunch of them. The storm didn't actually intercede. It was just by virtue of the military, the naval strategic genius of a guy by the name of Horatio Nelson, the great admiral of the British Navy, and the hero of Trafalgar, as they call him, by virtue of achieving this stunning victory. And as a result of this victory, you're asking yourself the question, well, why would Napoleon go and fight a naval battle when he knew the superiority, when he knew the supremacy on the sea of the British Royal Navy? When he knew that, why would he risk his ships? Well, because it turns out what before the Continental System was devised, Napoleon's great plan, his great strategic objective, was actually to invade Britain itself. Now, you can't invade Britain unless you have a fleet by which to facilitate access to Great Britain. Okay, you need a fleet large enough to accommodate your soldiers, les grandes armées, as it was known, the great army under the command of Napoleon. Right, you need a fleet that's large enough, and you can't actually have a fleet convey those soldiers from the coast of Normandy in northern France to the White Cliffs of Dover, right, in southern England. You can't do that unless you have security, unless you know that that operation is not going to be undermined by assaults by the Royal Navy, because they're going to be attacking your transport ships. So you have to vanquish, you have to annihilate British naval power as a necessary prerequisite to actually invading Great Britain. And so therefore, the reason for the Battle of Trafalgar was Napoleon's attempt to destroy the British naval power, so as to reduce their capacity to defend and protect their shores, the homeland shores of Great Britain, so that if in fact Napoleon had won the Battle of Trafalgar, the naval battle, right, well, then he would have been able to invade Great Britain. And then history would have been much, much different. And perhaps we'd all be speaking French right now and not English. Well, actually, no, that would have been the case because the United States already existed. How did things work out? Well, Napoleon couldn't invade Great Britain because he lost too many ships, because he lost the strategic initiative on the high seas, and because Britain essentially asserted its dominance, its naval superiority over the French and the Spanish and whoever else, whatever other ships Napoleon could drag in to fight against the British. So the British have supremacy, the reigning supremacy over the high seas. And so what's the other mechanism you have available so as to constrain and to literally effectuate a strangulation, an economic strangulation of Great Britain? Well, we close off the ports, so there's no trade going into Great Britain. And Great Britain is a small place. It's an island nation. It relies upon all kinds of imports so as to sustain itself. It can't subsist upon its own homegrown products. But alas, what did Napoleon fail to contemplate? This great strategic mastermind, this Machiavellian sort of shrewd operator. What did he fail to contemplate? He failed to contemplate that Russia, even though it was ostensibly his ally, because there was this thing called the Treaty of Talist, whereby the Russian Tsar Alexander and Napoleon actually sat down across from each other at this table on this river in the at the border, the periphery of Russia and Poland, and they made a treaty, which they weren't going to attack each other, right? And they were going to be, at least in theory, amicably disposed. They weren't going to be combatant. They were going to be belligerent towards each other. Well, that theory didn't really work out very well because the Russians said, look, there's nothing in this treaty that stipulates that we can't actually engage in trade relations because we are, after all, a sovereign country. We maintain our sovereignty, and therefore we maintain our prerogative to control our own self-determination, which, of course, is inclusive of determining who we engage in trade affairs with. And, of course, Napoleon is saying, well, you have functionally and affirmatively violated the terms of this treaty by engaging in behavior which is solicitous of my enemies, right? It aids and abets and offers them comfort and support and literally sustenance. And by doing that, you are in prima facie violation of this treaty, and therefore that gives me the right to repudiate the treaty, and that gives me the right to attack you, the Russians. And so we're going to get to Napoleon's invasion of Russia here in a minute, because I do have to cover that, and I don't have much time left, and there's only so much time. There's too many things to talk about here. But suffice it to say, for those who are wondering, why would Napoleon risk invading Russia? Okay, it seems to be a blunder waiting to happen. It seems to be a huge, tremendous liability, a huge logistical encumbrance in terms of the preparations, in terms of the material and the resources and the assets and the men, and all the sorts of costs that you're going to incur as a result of invading Russia, a place as large as Russia. Well, why would you do that? Well, of course, the reason is it's I have to do this to get to that, right? It's a prerequisite, okay? It's sort of an a priori condition that must be met before you actually consummate the overall strategic objective. And the overall strategic objective for Napoleon at this time still was, I want to effectuate a complete economic strangulation of Great Britain. And the only way to do that is to ensure Russia complies with this so-called Continental System by ceasing and desisting from trading with Great Britain, because that's what the Russians were doing. They were not so sneakily doing that, right? Behind the back, not even behind the back, in the front of the face of Napoleon, right? They were flaunting it right there in front of his face, right? What are you going to do about it? You French bitch, right? What are you going to do? Come on, bring it on. We're Russians, right? We drink vodka, we have a good time, right? We fight like Soviet partisans. We will kick your ass. Come on over here and bring it, right? And Napoleon was like, all right, I'll bring it. It's about to be brought, okay? And Napoleon does bring it. How does he bring it? He brings almost 600,000 soldiers, all from all corners of Europe, right? Because remember, Napoleon controls almost the entire landmass of Europe, excepting Russia and excepting Portugal, and he was almost in the final stages of consummating control over Portugal, because there was a war ongoing there in Portugal against Spain. But he controls nearly the entire landmass of continental Europe. And so, of course, you have French soldiers, you have Prussian soldiers, you have Austrian soldiers, you have German soldiers, you have soldiers from all across Europe, right? And he amasses this giant army, and he thinks by virtue of, well, not just by virtue of its sheer size, because Napoleon was never one to rely exclusively on size. And that's a very presumptuous way of thinking tactically, to think that, oh, well, by virtue of having superior numbers, the numerosity, I will be able to overwhelm my adversary by virtue of having more guys than them, and that will give me victory on the battlefield. No, it doesn't always work that way. In fact, rarely does it work that way. But, of course, why do you have so many soldiers? Well, it's not just a matter of, I need to have more soldiers than them, because when we actually face the Russians, well, I better have numerical superiority, because I got to have more guys out there, because, if we're killing each other at an equal rate, well, then I'm gonna be victorious at the end of the day, because I got more guys left than they do, right? It's just a matter of attrition. Well, yeah, it is a matter of attrition, right? But it's not a matter of attrition in battle that Napoleon is concerned about. He's concerned about natural attrition, okay? Now, Napoleon, very foolishly, much like Hitler, in fact, I think it was 100, what did I count? 123 days, 123 years to almost to the day. Napoleon invades Russia on June 23rd, 1812. Hitler invades the Soviet Union, which was Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and Latvia and Estonia and a lot of other places. Hitler invades what was then Russia on June 22nd, 1941. Okay, 1 day and I don't know what that is, 132 years to the, well, it's 132 years and 24 hours, right? It's almost to the day, okay? Almost to the day. Now, why am I trying to draw this parallel, this corollary, this historical comparison? Because part of this class is looking at what happened then, and then extrapolating and trying to draw certain inferences from what happened then, and applying those inferences in a constructive way so as to understand what happened now, or what happened more close to now, okay? And what happened in 1941 was blunderous, okay? It was catastrophically foolish of Hitler to undertake an invasion of the Soviet Union. In fact, I still contend, as a student of the Second World War, as a student of fascist Germany, because I think it's absolutely fascinating, it is terrifying, kind of like tornadoes, right? It's absolutely engrossing, right? As a student of Nazi Germany, I still maintain to this day, had Hitler not invaded the Soviet Union, he would have been able to do what Napoleon had been aspiring to do, which is to just kind of maintain some kind of homeostasis over continental Europe and control and be the overlord over continental Europe. But that wasn't good enough, right? Because that's the problem with men of great genius and men of great ambition, is that, like any other man before them in history, like Caesar, like Alexander, like Achilles at Troy, what do they want? They all want more, and they always want more. Okay, and they won't cease wanting more until such time as they've tested their limits. And Napoleon hadn't yet tested his limits because he'd been so successful thus far. Why would he think otherwise? Right? Well, you should think otherwise because you have to literally advance thousands, not hundreds, but thousands of miles. Now, understand. Try to put this in the proper context. You're waiting until June to invade. You're waiting until the end of June to invade. Okay, June 23rd, 1812. What does that mean? Think about this in terms of the timetable, right? Now, this is even more true for Napoleon than it was for Hitler because Hitler's armies were mechanized, right? He had panzers, right? He had Panzerkampfwagens, okay? Those are the tanks, right? He had Sonderkraftwagens. Those are the SDKFZs, they call them. Those are the armored cars. They're really funny, actually. Well, they're awesome is what they are. And they're not awesome because they're Nazi Germany. They're just awesome because they're a very fine fighting vehicle. He had Luftwaffe, right? He had Stukas, he had dive bombers, he had Henkels and Junkers and all kinds of aircraft, right? And then, of course, he had modernized mechanized infantry, right? But Napoleon had not really mechanized. He didn't have, nothing was mechanized. It was before, well, this is after the Industrial Revolution, but the principles, the precepts of the Industrial Revolution hadn't actually been applied to the efficacy of military logistics. And so if you got to walk from Poland, to Moscow, or Borodino, which is where the first great confrontation between the Russians and the French army actually happened. If you have to walk the distance, which is essentially the equivalent of the distance from me, where I'm at, to where you guys are at, right? Imagine walking 600 miles, right? Now imagine doing that imagine doing that with horses and carriages and artillery pieces, which are extremely heavy, which have to be carried by oxen or conveyed by oxen. Now, I don't know if you guys know anything about draft animals, if you've seen any pictures of oxen, or perhaps you guys grew up on farms. I don't know. Maybe you did. You live in the UP. That's what you guys do up there, right? I'm not being disingenuous. I'm not trying to denigrate anybody. I actually have a lot of respect for farm people. The Amish are. You don't know country strong until you go and you meet some Amish guys, and they will whoop your ass even though they don't know anything about jiu-jitsu, right? They will whoop your ass because they'll be able to literally punch you so hard that it'll decapitate your head, right? I'm making this up, obviously, right? But they're hella strong, right? Country strong on roids, essentially. Why is it taking so long? Right. Well, you have to convey all the materials associated with the army, right? You have to convey the field hospitals. You have to convey the artillery. You have to convey all the provisions, right? The food and the munitions and things, right? And that's slow. That's a slow process because this stuff is very heavy. It's very cumbersome, and you're using draft animals. Again, I don't know if he was using oxen necessarily, but I would think he was probably using draft horses, right? The Budweiser horses, the Percherons, and I forget I should know this. I used to work with them up at the Grand Hotel. The Percherons and well, that's good enough, right? The Budweiser horses, you guys know what they are, but they're very slow. They're very strong. It's kind of like an engine that has a very sort of low gear, right? It's a big heavy engine, right? You think about train engines, right? You got 5,000 horsepower, but they're geared very low, so it's a pulling power. It's not a high speed power, and that's the kind of power that draft animals have. So Napoleon, because he waited until June 23rd, right? Again, think about this in terms of timetable. We need to get to Moscow before it gets cold, right? But what's going to happen between here and Moscow, between the eastern periphery of Poland, and by the time we get to Moscow? Well, we got to cross rivers, right? First, there's the Vistula, then there's the Volga, and then there's the other rivers, and I can't remember what they are, but right, we got to cross rivers, all right? That's going to take a long time, and not only is it's not going to take a long time because we have to walk all that way. I mean, that in of itself is going to take a long time. If you were just one person walking from, I don't know, southern Poland to Moscow, that would take you months, right? If you weren't cheating and hitchhiking, right? But imagine an army of 600,000 men. And you have to have provisions and supplies and all kinds of resources so as to be able to accommodate the needs of that army, right? That's going to take even longer. The bigger the army, the more the substantial logistic undertaking is going to be, the more tedious and the more cumbersome and the more time-consuming it's going to be, right? Now, Napoleon maybe hadn't really fully anticipated this. Maybe he just hadn't understood the implications of the size, the grandeur of Russia. But if you start in June, you're not going to be in the midst of Russia. You're not going to be in the Russian hinterland, in the area between Poland and Moscow, which, by the way, for those of you who haven't been there, and I know at least one of you has been, but he's probably too young to remember what it looked like, go and watch YouTube videos, other YouTube videos besides this that are even more instructive than this one, right? YouTube videos of what Russia looks like in the farm areas of, I don't know what you'd search for, right? But it looks like Nebraska, okay? Right? It looks like, I mean, just fields, just empty fields, right? Or better yet, much of it actually looks like the Sini stretch, right? From Munising down to Sini, okay, right, or beyond Sini all the way down to Newbury, right? Think about that, okay? For those of you who have been down that really beautiful and picturesque and really engaging stretch of how I guess that's US 2 or whatever that is. That's still 41 down there, right? You'll think, wow, that's really pristine land, isn't it? Well, it's pristine in the sense that it's very robust and rugged. But if you're marching 400,000 men across the Sini stretch, and it's just, literally mile after mile of that, okay, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles, that land is not very bountiful. It doesn't produce much, okay? It doesn't have it's not naturally very plentiful in terms of being able to provision you with materials and supplies and food, okay? Now think about it this way. Napoleon was used to conquering Central and Western European nations. All right, those nations were, by and large, relative to Russia, highly developed in terms of their infrastructure. They had roads, they had highways. I'm not talking about I-75, but I'm talking about the equivalent of I-75 back in the early 1800s. Okay, and so they had really effective road systems, and those road systems were highly conducive to the quick dissemination and deployment of military resources. Whereas you go into Russia, no roads. Right? Trails, okay? In fact, much of Napoleon's army actually invaded Russia through Lithuania. And if you go through Lithuania, and Lithuania probably still looks like this. Lithuania is kind of like the UP, right? Which is a good thing, right? Because being in the UP means you're honorable and you're strong and you're courageous and you're all those things, right? You're a hardy breed, you Upers up there. I wish I could be one of you, but I'm not. I'm an honorary Up because I spent, I think, 3 years up there. Maybe I guess you got to spend 7 years up there, so I'm a dishonorary troll, is what I am, because I live under the bridge. But Lithuania is a very rugged country, and there's just the Tolstoy, Leo Tolstoy, Count Tolstoy. He was he's the guy that wrote War and Peace. Okay, for those of you who don't know him, him and Fyodor Dostoevsky are my two favorite Russian novelist. And for those of you who don't know anything about Tolstoy, Tolstoy was a serving officer in the Imperial Russian Army, the Army of the Tsar, not at this time, but after this time in the Crimea War. But he would have been privy to much of the same sort of logistical encumbrances that were faced with the Napoleonic armies. So he would have been able to represent in his narrative when he's talking about War and Peace. And I think they actually just made a movie about this last year. I think it sucked, actually. War and Peace itself is a magisterial novel. It's an epic novel. It's like 1,000 pages long. I tried to read it once. I got through about the first 600 pages, and you'd say, well, shit, you're 60% of the way through, Jeff. Why don't you finish the rest of the 400? I just couldn't. It just didn't have the time for it. But Tolstoy actually describes in very vivid and visceral detail the nature of the French invasion of Russia and how tedious it was and how there were really just these rugged trails, right? Imagine going down an ATV trail with an army of 600,000 men, and you've got all these wagons and all these oxen and all these artillery pieces, and you're going through this terrain, this very difficult, very challenging, very cumbersome terrain in the fall in Russia. And in the fall in Russia, you have something called the Rasputa. Okay, it's kind of named after, it's reminiscent of the guy Rasputin, who was the advisor to Alexandria, the last czarina of Russia. And the Rasputa, right? Rasputa, kind of like Putin, Rasputin, kind of like that, right? Rasputa is actually in reference to a particular weather system. It's kind of like the monsoon season in certain parts of Western and Central Russia. It's not actually a monsoon from a climatological, meteorological perspective. It's actually very, very different than monsoons, because monsoons are created by different mechanisms in terms of the weather. But it's kind of like that in terms of its effects, right? So it's a lot of rain, and what happens when the rain falls? A lot, right? Very abundant, precipitous rainfall. Well, I know, because I've been living down here during global climate change the last couple of years down here in Metro Detroit. We've had some tumultuous biblical rains down here in the last 6 months, actually, throughout the course of July and June and August, actually, and even this month. And I was looking out the window the other day as it was raining for literally 72 hours straight. Imagine this, 72 hours incessant rainfall. I was looking for Noah. I was looking for the ark. I was looking for the animals. I thought I heard a giraffe out there, but I didn't. Okay, it was an opossum, right? But what happens when you have torrential rainfalls and consistently throughout the course of many, many days and many, many weeks incessantly? Well, the roads that are already completely inadequate to the task of conveying this massive arsenal that you're dragging into Russia with you, well, now they're all washed out, right? And now what do you have to do? Well, yeah, you're shit out of luck, son. Okay, you Napoleon, I shouldn't call him son, your Majesty. But you're shit out of luck, my man. because now you don't even have roads. So guess what? It's going to take you even longer to get to Moscow. And what happens before he gets to Moscow? The Russians engage in a scorched earth policy. They do the same thing. I can't count it. What, in 1941 from 1812, and I should figure this out. It's like 130. It's about 129 years, I guess that's what it is. I don't know. I can't do math. Let's call it 130 years, give or take, right? 130 years later, the Soviets do the same damn thing. Okay, well, the same blessed thing. In fact, you guys who know about the war in Russia, the Soviet, the invasion of Russia by the Nazi German forces, the Soviets and the Russians still to this day, and I know because I'm very intimately acquainted with a couple of Russian women. They're absolute, well, I'll just say that they're nice, lovely Russian women. They still refer to World War II as the Great Patriotic War. Imagine that, the Great Patriotic War. Of course, these are people who also still have little statues and little portraits of Joseph Stalin in their homes next to the portraits of St. Jude, right, and St. Catherine and all the other great saints that the Russian Orthodox Church venerates. Imagine that. You got a portrait of a guy who killed more people than Adolf Hitler per capita, right? Of his own people, actually, right? If you include all the people that died in the course of the war, which I think you have to because he was a very capricious man in terms of his unjudicious use of his military forces. But we're going to talk about Stalin and all the horrors of Stalinism later on. Suffice it to say, though, when the Napoleonic armies invaded into Russia, they were depending on two things, or they presupposed, based on their experience, that they would have two resources available to them. Number one, infrastructure that was viable, that was feasible, that was functional, that they could avail themselves of, i.e. roads that were conducive to conveying large amounts of material and men, right? Which they didn't have, right? Either they didn't have any roads, or the meager roads that they had were rendered impassable and non-viable by virtue of this Rasputa, the rain effect, right? The Russian monsoon, if you will. And number two, they assumed that they were going to have bountiful harvests. They're going to be apples and cherries and all kinds of this good shit to eat when we're in here, right? Well, you walking through Sini, right, along US 2, is there all kinds of food for you to eat? How many McDonald's and Taco Bells do you have along the Sini stretch? Well, if you're hella hungry and you run out of gas, are you going to probably starve to death out there in the middle of Sini? Yeah, you probably will. Unless you can go and hunt with your hands or something, right? And go catch, I don't know, beavers and whoever else lives out there, right? And then eat them. Okay, you're probably gonna die. It was so there was insufficient. There was an inadequacy of food resources endemic to the land, because even though we think about Russia as being sort of the breadbasket of Europe, it's not. Ukraine and Belarus are the breadbasket of Europe. Much of Russia, it's forests, okay? And the biome of Europe, the ecology of Europe, of Russia at that time, 200 years ago, was much different than the ecology of Europe is now, right? Just think about the ecology of Michigan 200 years ago, right? Michigan just looked like, all of Michigan looked like the UP, okay? Or most of it did, right? Detroit, of course, did. And it was developed by, well, 1800s. No, all of Michigan looked like the UP, right? So Russia was a very heavily forested area. And when you have forests, you don't have much room for agricultural production, right? Agricultural resources, whatever, the cultivation, right? You don't have much room for that. And not only that, but you're facing a populace which is extraordinarily hostile to you, okay? Now there's a difference. There's a fundamental difference between how the Russian people, the lowest peons and the peasants and the serfs, they refer to them as, right? The serfs, by the way, were essentially indentured servants. They were essentially one rank above slave. Okay, imagine that, one rank above slave. But alas, the serfs were freed by Tsar Alexander II. 1860, I think it was 1860. It was like a year or two before we enacted, or Lincoln promulgated the Emancipation Proclamation. So actually the Russian slaves were freed more quickly than the African American slaves. Imagine that. But then again, almost every person in Russia, unless you were a member of the aristocracy, was a slave, right? And for insights on this, read Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment. He talks about the Russian serfs and how horrible their life is. In fact, I think Tolstoy talks about this too. Anna Karenina. Yeah, he talks all about it. Go see Anna Karenina. Amazing movie, beautiful woman. The Russian girl down the street actually looks like Anna Karenina. She looks like the girl from the Pirates of the Caribbean, Keira Knightley, who plays Anna Karenina in the titular role of the movie that they made a couple of years ago. Great movie. I'm not just saying that because I'm a huge fan of Keira Knightley. Okay, so what about the peasants? The peasants in Russia construed the Tsar, who was the king, as being, they called him the what do they call him? The little father, okay, the little father. I don't know Russian well enough to be able to tell you what that is. But the little father means that he's an intermediate. intermediary between God. He's slightly below God and slightly above just a common, well, a great deal above a man, right? So he's kind of like a legend, right? He's kind of like a legendary, like a titan, right? You talk about the Titans. You guys saw the Revenge of the Titans or whatever that stupid movie was with the guy from Avatar, right? And then there's something like Beowulf. Think about Beowulf. There's a great movie. Angelina Jolie, absolutely amazing in that movie. Well, she's amazing. She's never not amazing, but great movie. Angelina Jolie and it's the only person I can think of right now, but the Brian Gleason, the guy from Braveheart, some other great people. Oh, of course, Hannibal Lecter, Anthony Hopkins. But he's kind of like, people perceive him as, he's sort of like a deity, right? He's like a quasi-deity. He's like a demigod, right? He's like a little mini-god, right? And because the Russian peasants were living in such stupefying ignorance. I mean, they were illiterate, they were unenlightened. The Enlightenment hadn't reached Russia because the Russian czars were very opposed to the Enlightenment because they realized that the more enlightened people were, the more they began to think about things. The more they began to think about things, the more they began to desire a radical change in terms of their governments, because they realized that their form of government was autocratic. It was completely totalitarian, and it was very draconian, and they want to change. And so there was no Enlightenment in Russia. There wasn't an Enlightenment at this time in Russia. The Enlightenment precepts hadn't gotten to Russia until really the end of the 19th century. In fact, it actually took until, you could make the argument, I think, until the Bolsheviks, until Trotsky and Lenin, Stalin et al. Began to promulgate their particular ideology, when really Enlightenment precepts began to gain traction. But that's a different story for another day. So as a result of the stupidity, I mean, not the ignorance, not the stupidity, right? Yeah, because they're all a bunch of retards in Russia now. The ignorance of the common Russian people. They ignorantly believed that their overlord, their ruler, their czar, as they call him, the king, the emperor, was like a god. And if you believe that your ruler is like a god, okay, that he has semi-divine powers, and the Russians are very superstitious people at that time. Indeed, my girlfriend, she's absolutely beautiful. I love her. She's my ex-girlfriend, so I sort of love her. That's a weird thing to say. Either you love somebody or you don't. I love things about her, right? But she's a very superstitious woman. And even her daughter, even though she's raised in America, she's superstitious too. Russians are they tend to be more superstitious than Western people, right? And for as superstitious as they are now, they were hella more superstitious back then, 200 years ago. And so much so, they believed that their ruler, because he was the, quote, little father, because he was semi-divine, he was like Santa Claus, right? Well, you better watch out. You better not shout. You better not pout. I'm telling you why. Because Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, is coming to get you. I can't say, that's a horrible song, actually. But imagine that, right? Imagine thinking some shit like that. That, oh, I'm gonna be a guy, I better not, I better not desecrate the picture of the Tsar tonight, or, I better be nice to my children because he's watching me, because he's omnipotent, and he's not omniscient, and he's omnipotent and omnipowerful, and he's all these things. Well, if you believe that, and you know that the land of Russia is the personal property of the Tsar, because that's what they believe, because it was a totalitarian monarchy, right? Then don't you have a sacred duty as a peasant, as a serf, to defend that with your life, using whatever means necessary so as to resist the invader, the French invader, and to preserve the integrity and the viability of the reign of the Tsar, to protect him and his interests from the foreign invaders? You have a sacred obligation to do so. And the reason that's sacred, the sacredness of that obligation, the sanctity of that duty, devolves from or derives from your subjective and perhaps erroneous, but nevertheless well-founded, if you're an ignorant peasant, belief that the Tsar is actually divine, right? So unlike when the Napoleonic armies marched into central Germany, and marched into Bohemia, Moravia, and Austria, and the Netherlands, and Italy, and Spain, and Portugal, and all the other places, right? Unlike that, where you had peasants who were, number one, they were enlightened. Number two, they didn't believe that their rulers were like Santa Claus and could watch them when they were sleeping and convict them of thought crime, right? And number three, they didn't believe that the rulers had divine powers and they were like God, right? And then they could sort of strike them down with lightning if they didn't do their utmost to resist Napoleon. Well, you had, in those other countries, you had either passive resistance, right? Like passive aggressive. Oh, we don't like you French guys, but hey, look, I got all this corn over here. If you guys want to come here and eat this, right? Here, I got this in the bag. We don't like you guys, right? No, you had active aggressive, right? You had actually aggressive resistance, okay, on the part of the Russian peasantry. And I don't think the historians really talk about this enough. So I like to talk about this because it is very much reminiscent of what happens 130 years later to the day, almost to the day, when the Nazi armies much more successfully invade the Soviet Union. Although it's relative, right? It's relative to the fact that they had Sonderkraftwagens and Panzerkampfwagens and Junkers and Stukas and all the other advancements in technology that they had at their disposal. But the Nazis were resisted just as vehemently, in fact, I would say even more zealously and fanatically, by the Soviet partisans. Right, those just like mom and pop with their shotgun and hiding out in the fields or in the forest. And there's actually a wonderful Daniel Craig movie about this with Liv Schreiber and some other people, and it's called Defiance. Came out in 2008 when he started doing the James Bond movie. It's absolutely amazing. It's about the Belarusian partisans not resisting Napoleon. I'm talking about the Second World War here, but if you want to know about just how tenacious the resistance was in Russia and indeed in the Soviet Union, right? Because there really is a symmetry here in terms of the degree to which the Russians are willing to sacrifice their lives on behalf of defending their nation because they believe that it is a sacred duty. They believe that they believe it's a sacred duty for different reasons. In 1812, they believed it was a sacred duty because the Russian Tsar is literally the master of the universe, right? He's like Skeletor, he's like He-Man, right? He's the master of the universe, right? He-Man, he's like, you guys have seen the cartoon, hopefully, well, probably not because none of you are old enough to actually remember that, but He-Man is the master of the universe, right? Well, so too was the Tsar, okay? He was the master of their universe as far as they were concerned, and so therefore they had a sacred obligation to lay down their lives. Whereas, of course, in the Second World War, the duty arose from the fact that this is the Soviet state, and we are all in this together, and we are defending the state, and the state is in furtherance of the interests of the common people, and therefore it's our interest that we're defending, so we better be willing to lay down our lives. We're afraid of the KGB and the Czech and the agents of Stalin killing us if we don't do this. Okay, so that's the invasion of the Soviet. Yeah, that's not the invasion of the Soviet Union. That's the invasion of Russia. What happened? The Russians invoke a strategy of essentially hit and run and hide and seek. Okay, I like to describe it as hit and run and hide and seek. Right. Well, what do I mean by that? It's hit and run in the sense that the Russians only have a few really sizable field armies. They have about 3 or 4 major forces in Russia at this time. They've got a lot of soldiers that they can conscript, but it takes a long time for the Russians to actually mobilize their forces. And we're going to talk about the First World War if I ever have time for it. We'll talk about the mobilization process because Russia has a very rudimentary infrastructure. It takes a long, long time to get from A to B because Russia's freaking big, okay? And it takes a long time to mobilize. But once it gets mobilized, well, then you're in a world of hurt, right? It's like not Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson, he danced like a butterfly and stung like a bee. It's like maybe Joe Louis, George Foreman, right? He's a big heavyweight, right? George Foreman or Batista, right? You guys know Batista, right? He goes into the UFCs and the cage matches now. He's sort of a mixed martial artist guy. In fact, the other guy who did that too, the other guy that came over from WWF, WWE, I can't remember his name, but I want to call him Lex Luthor. That's not his name, but it's like going into the ring with a heavyweight. Okay, the heavyweight, he's slow, he's cumbersome, right? Takes him a while to sort of get on target and get on point. But once he gets his game on, right? Once he actually connects the punches, right? Once he's pummeling you, he's gonna knock you the F out, okay? And that's what Russia is like. It's the Russian bear. It's not like the little cuddly black bears that you can go and play with right in the tree, or the panda bears or some bullshit like that. It's like the grizzly bear. It's the Kodiak giant, and he's gonna tear you the F up, right? He's gonna eat you up. He's gonna right? He's gonna rip you up, okay? That's the Russians, right? But it takes that. He's dormant right now, right? He's kind of in hibernation. He's tired. He's sleepy. He's still recovering from the hangover from the night before, right? He's got to get up and drink some water and start getting his sweat on and start getting worked up and start going out there and working on his cardio, right? And that's why it takes Russia to it takes them a while to mobilize, but once it's fully mobilized, well, then you bring to bear the full resources of the Russian populace, and they are many, many times more numerous than the French. And not only that, but you're in your own country, right? So you are in friendly terrain. You are being supported and sustained by the peasants, who obviously believe it's a sacred obligation to support the armies of the Tsar because they're afraid of him because he's like Santa Claus. And then you also have access to you have home court advantage, I should say, right? Whereas Napoleon, he's got to bring all of his supplies and all of his human resources and all his materials from all the way back in Poland. And the further he advances into Russia, the farther away that is. All right, and the more tedious and the more cumbersome and the more time-consuming it becomes to actually replenish and restore his losses. So, and it's a zero-sum game, right? He only, now I can say, well, he only brings 600,000 guys, and you say, well, that's a lot of guys, Jeff. Well, yeah, but the misconception about the invasion, the French invasion of Russia, is that people think it was the Russian winter, right? It was generals January and February that defeated Napoleon, right? As the French marshals used to say, right? It wasn't really generals. Well, it was generals January and February, which did a lot of collateral damage to the French army. But generals July and August and September and October, those months did a whole hell of a lot more damage. And the reason why is because think of it this way: when you don't have adequate supplies to provision your troops, what do they have to rely upon to subsist off of? Well, they've got to drink the water from the ditch on the side of the road, right? Which, by the way, isn't much of a road, and that's where the horses take shits over there, right? I mean, that's all putrid water, anyways. But you got to drink. Imagine that. That's revolting. It's disgusting. It's absolutely repugnant, right? Not only that, but it's completely unsanitary. And so you're going to get, E. coli and salmonella and giardiasin and all kinds of bacteria is going to be proliferating in that stuff. You don't have penicillin. You can't inoculate yourself against that, right? So his men, Napoleon's men, are dying massively of diseases as a result of having to subsist off of materials that are really they're either contaminated water, such as contaminated water, or food that isn't really fit for human consumption, right? Because they don't have enough, the food that is fit for human consumption isn't bountiful and plentiful enough to support and sustain 600,000 men, so it only goes directly to the 150,000 guys who are in the front lines, right, who are most likely to actually encounter the Russian adversary. So back to hit and run. Hit and run, number one, because the Russians engage in, as I say, they're Joe Louis, right? They're George Foreman. It takes them a while to get back on their A game, right? But initially, what they're doing is they're doing little weak punches, right? So they're hitting. They're making raids against the large French army, and they're dispossessing the French army of the ability to actually go out there and forage for food, to go out there and find berries and whatever. I don't know. I don't even know what grows in the wilderness of Russia. Mushrooms and things, right? Maybe some hallucinogenic mushrooms. Maybe they get really all tripped out and they won't even care that they're starving anymore, right? That's the best idea, right? Well, they can't because you got these small Russian forces, mostly cavalry, because they're very quick, they're very nimble, very agile, tactically speaking, hitting and then running away and then hiding in the forest or in the bogs or the scenic ecology, the terrain like that, right? And the French can't find these guys, okay, because they just kind of blend in and disappear, kind of like what the North Vietnamese, like the Viet Cong, the Viet Minh were doing to the French in Indochina and later on the United States when we invaded the North Vietnamese. Hit and run. The Viet Cong were sneaky sons of bitches, right? They were hiding out in rice paddies. They were wearing the sampan hats and shit, right? We couldn't even tell them from good guy from enemy from whoever, right? Same thing in Russia. Now, what else did I say? It's like hide and seek. The Russians knew that they were going to have to, for the most part, they were going to have to avoid a large-scale, full-scale pitched battle, as it were, until they could select ground of their choosing that was favorable to the Russians. And the reason they had to do this, so they had to essentially hide, right? And then eventually when the battlefield was favorable, the terrain, the topography, and the climate and everything else, right, the logistics, everything else was maximally conducive to favoring the interests of the Russians strategically in terms of all the atmospheric qualities associated with the battlefield, right? Well, then they seek, right? Then they seek. Okay, that's why I say it's hide, run away and hide from Napoleon and his marshals and his 600,000 guys, right? By the way, the longer we the Russians hide, the better the odds are going to be in our favor, because the longer we wait, the more delay is occasioned, the more time passes, the less Napoleon's army has to be able to provision itself with, the more soldiers are going to die through natural attrition. And therefore, the smaller the army is going to be when we actually go to fight it, right? So the Russians have every incentive to try to delay this confrontation to the extent that they can, and that's why I say it's like it's a game of hide and seek. Now, it's also the more strategically and historically, technically apropos term to use would be the Fabian. It's known as the Fabian Strategy. Okay, and for those military historians out there, for those armchair generals, you see I got a chair with arms on it. That's intentional, because I'm definitely an armchair general. I'm going to go up and actually play some Total War here in about, well, I should have been 20 minutes ago because I told you guys it was a little over an hour, coming up on an hour and a half here. I still have 2 pages to talk about, so by this rate we'll be over. We'll be done in about 4 hours from now. The hide and seek game is also known as the Fabian Strategy. All right, and again, for those armchair generals out there, for those of you who studied military history, you'll know that the Fabian Strategy is named after Fabius Maximus, who was a consul of Rome, a commanding general of the Roman armies during the latter stages of the Republic, and he was one of the generals who was, besides Scipio Africanus, was probably the general who was most responsible for the defeat of Hannibal, at least in Italy. When Hannibal invaded Italy, Hannibal was a Carthaginian general, and the Romans were afraid of engaging with Hannibal directly because they knew he was superior in terms of his tactical abilities, as a strategic mastermind. He was on par with Caesar, or George Patton, or even, dare I say, Napoleon or Alexander, in fact. And so the Fabian Strategy is essentially the strategy employed by the Russians, or indeed the Romans, back in the Carthaginian, the Punic Wars, as they refer to them as. You guys don't need to know about the Carthaginians and the Romans. I'm just saying that for those of you who do care about these things and who are interested in historical connections and me making these connections between the dots, I'm saying that this is like the Fabian Strategy in the sense that that's what it is. It's wait, hide, right, and then wait, and then collect your resources, consolidate your forces, and then attack when the time is propitious, when the moment is opportune, when the terrain is favorable, when the weather is good, okay, with the sun at your back, with the wind at the face of the enemy, so on and so forth, right? And that's exactly what the Russians did. And they attacked at a place called Borodino, or they set it up so that the confrontation, the big battle, was going to happen in the place called Borodino. And it was ways outside of Moscow. The French win this battle. Okay, Napoleon is able to achieve victory, but it is a Pyrrhic victory. Pyrrric. It's named after a guy by the name of Pyrrhus, King Pyrrhus of, Christ, I should know this, Macedonia. I think it wasn't Macedonia. Epirus, King Pyrrhus of Epirus. And the reason it's called the Pyrrhic victory is because way back when, again, drawing the analogy between what's happening in Napoleon and Russia and what's happening in Rome 2,000 years before, the early Roman Republic engaged in this battle against Epirus, and they won this victory, but it was so costly a victory that they really couldn't afford to compensate for their losses. And so they snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, if you will, right? Or it's winning the battle and losing the war, shall we say, okay, right? Because Napoleon did win this battle, but it was extremely costly. And of all people, of these two forces, the French and the Russians, Napoleon can ill afford. He cannot afford to take considerable losses in combat because he's already taken considerable losses without combat, right? Just by virtue of natural attrition, because his guys are dying because they're drinking swamp water and they're eating, I don't know, shit off the road. I don't know what they're eating, right? They're eating bark off trees and grass. They're like on the North Korean diet, okay? I shouldn't make a joke at that, right? But that's literally what most of the North Koreans eat. They're eating individual grains of blades of rice, grains of rice and blades of grass, and they're peeling bark off trees. It's absolutely horrible. So, the Battle of Borodino. What happened as a result of this? The Russians got to Moscow, right? Because Moscow is still further east. Napoleon's going from west to east, right? Imagine this is going from west to east. Right? That's west, that's east. And he gets to Borodino. He wins, but he suffers tremendous casualties, right? So his army is far less potent, far less powerful than it was before. And the further east he goes, the more laborious and tedious and attenuated his supply lines are. Not only that, but his supply lines are being compromised all over the place because they're being attacked. They're being attacked by the Ochaka, right? Which is that I said that wrong. I need to have my Russian girlfriend or her beautiful daughter come in here and interpret for me. But it's the Russian peasants, and they form a militia. It's like an ad hoc sort of informal militia, right? And these guys, these Russian peasants, these militia guys, are out there and they're attacking Napoleon's supply lines. So not only is it tedious, not only is it cumbersome because we got to get all this shit from all the way from Poland all the way into central Russia, but imagine going through the Sini Stretch without the highway there, just walking through a trail, right? And having like jihadists sneaking around in the woods out there, right? And they got the long beards and they got the gnarly facial hair and they got the shirt that says I love Muhammad or whatever, right? And they got AK-47s and they're trying to steal your Big Mac or something, right? Imagine that. Imagine how difficult it would be to fight a battle if that was in fact the case. Now that's not exactly symmetrical to what's happening in Russia, but it's kind of like that, right? Because you got they got the bugaboos coming out of the woodwork here, right? Literally, they're coming out of their cottages and their dachas and their little farmsteads and things, and they're attacking Napoleon's supply lines. So Napoleon, the further into Russia he gets, the more difficult it is for him to resupply. Therefore, the more casualties he suffers as a result of natural attrition, because it's getting colder now, because now we're talking about October. And Russia is much like the UP. It's kind of like the UP in terms of its climate, in terms of the ecology of Russia, right? It's in the same, well, actually, it's in a more northerly latitude. If you actually look at the latitude of the UP, that would be, I don't know, maybe north of Berlin, right? But much of the area, especially if you come through Lithuania, which is way, way north in Russia, well, you're going to be on a very northerly latitude. So, Moscow is like being up in Saskatchewan or something in terms of latitudinally where it's situated. And so the Russian winters start very early and they last very, very long, okay? And Napoleon's situation is becoming more and more precarious. His position is very, very precarious now. And not only that, but to add insult to injury, right, or to confound and exacerbate him even further, what do the Russians do? They burn Moscow. They burn Moscow. Okay, imagine that. It was sort of a Hobson's choice, right? Either we don't burn Moscow and we leave the city intact, and therefore we know Napoleon's going to reach Moscow, he's going to occupy Moscow, and he's going to have nice, comfortable buildings, and he's going to have all kinds of supplies and things and provisions. He's going to be able to sustain himself. He's going to have a base of operations, right? We're not going to give him, it's known as a forward operating base. You guys have served in Afghanistan, which I know none of you have, but maybe you know somebody who has, right? They had forward operating bases, right? It's like a base behind enemy lines up there with Owen Wilson. You guys have seen that movie? Kind of a stupid movie, but there you go. Forward operating base, right? The Russians don't want to give the French a forward operating base, so they give a base of operations deep in enemy territory to resupply, to sustain themselves, to then perhaps recruit new soldiers to secure their operations. Absolutely not. So if they didn't burn Moscow, that would be the result. Now, if they do burn Moscow, they desecrate this very historic, very significant, it almost has religious sort of significance to it. They desecrate this hallowed ground. But it was this was a necessity dictated by the expediencies and the exigencies of war, and that which is necessary can never be evil or never be bad. I think that was actually a quote from Spock from the latest Star Trek movie. Well, look, I don't know if the Russians were fans of Vulcan, but they certainly understood that it was more tactically and strategically expedient for them to deprive the enemy of a base of operations. And so Napoleon gets to Moscow and he realizes, I can't do anything here. So what does he do? He turns around and he goes back. But he doesn't wait until it gets warm. He turns around because he realizes he's gonna run out of supplies, and there's really nothing. There's not enough supplies in the city to sustain and support him, and he can't go east because the further east he goes, the more attenuated his supply lines become, the more exacerbated his position becomes. So he decides, I don't have a choice. I gotta go back. I gotta go back west. In the middle of the winter. Okay, and what ends up happening? There's some very, very, just really horrifying descriptions. I mean, some very visceral, very accurate descriptions of just how bad the long road from Moscow all the way back to friendly territory, which you get across the Vistula River back there in central Poland, how terrifying this was. Napoleon loses anywhere between 90 and 95% of his army. So of these 600,000 men that crossed over into Russia in 1812, the number that crossed back across the Vistula about a year later was anywhere between 10 and maybe 30,000. Okay, imagine that. Imagine the losses. Imagine the level of attrition. What is that? Well, that's 90% attrition, more than 90% attrition, right? I mean, imagine a United States military force in deployment, right? And it gets lost in Afghanistan or something, right? We suffer 90% casualties. Could you even imagine that? Now, those are the guys that's the death ratio, right? That's the KIA or MIA ratio. That's not the wounded, actually, right? Imagine the wounded, right? Those who suffered disease and maybe they survived, but they were scarred for life, or they were, rendered invalids because of the depredations of cholera or whatever else they were catching over there. I mean, man, this is just absolutely horrifying. And I think you have to concede, or at least I look at this and I say, well, it wasn't really the Russians that defeated Napoleon, because the Russians lost. They got their asses kicked in Borodino. Now, they did a good job. I mean, they fought honorably and they fought courageously, but they lost, okay? And, in warfare, it's a zero-sum game. Either you win or you lose. There is no, oh, well, they sort of won or they sort of lost. No, they lost, right? So the Russians were essentially getting their asses kicked all across Russia, but yet Napoleon lost. Napoleon lost. Did Napoleon lose because the Russians won? Did the Russians defeat Napoleon? No, I think Napoleon's endeavor was self-defeating in the sense that he should have known better. This strategic mastermind, this man who is very calculating, who takes into consideration even the most subtle aspects of environment and weather and terrain and topography and all the other sorts of things that a masterful general considers. And he didn't contemplate the size and the expansiveness and the scope of Russia and the fact that it didn't have an infrastructure and that it had a very hostile populace. He didn't contemplate for that. That is massive oversight on his behalf. Okay, let us talk about the after effects. And actually, I'm actually very close to finishing up on Napoleon. We're doing a pretty good job today, so I'm very happy with this. We can talk. That means I can spend all class period next time just talking about the author's book, because you know that's my favorite pastime in this class, is just waxing and waning about the author. So what happens as a result of this? Well, Napoleon loses so many men. Right, this grand army. This is the massive assemblage of all the soldiers that he can find across Europe that are under his control. Loses so many men that he just can't afford to recoup and restore those losses. He can't replenish the losses in time, and the rest of Europe realizes that, well, now is an opportune time to seize upon our destiny, to seek independence from this subjugation, this overlordship of the French and this overlordship of Napoleon, the person of Napoleon. And so many of these European countries that were formerly allied with Napoleon decided they're going to break off and they're going to declare not only independence from him, but they're going to declare themselves hostile to him, and they're going to form another coalition. And so this is all called the Wars of the Coalition. They refer to it as, I mean, it's in the vernacular of historiography, either the Napoleonic era or the Wars of the Coalitions, right? Because there are various coalitions of various allied powers that align themselves against the French. And I think this is the 9th coalition. Well, anyways, there's many. I don't care if you know how many coalitions there are. All you got to know is that the rest of Europe essentially got to the point where they were so not just frustrated by being oppressed, and they weren't really oppressed by Napoleon. This is not like a Nazi occupation. The analogy ends with the comparison between the French invasion of Russia and the Nazi German occupation of the Soviet Union. That's where the analogy really ends. I mean, I guess you could say it's analogous in that Napoleon was much like Hitler. He was megalomaniacal in that he wanted to conquer as much as he possibly could, and he didn't really know what his limitations were until he got to Russia. And then, of course, the Russians actually, taught him a hard lesson, or Russia itself taught him a hard lesson. Okay, and much like Hitler and his partisans, they learned the same thing. But I think that it's not that the French were building concentration camps and they were killing all the Germans and the Italians and whoever else they weren't doing anything like that. But I think that the people of Europe realized that the only reason they acquiesced to the rule of the French, the rule of Napoleon and his brothers and his generals and his buddies and whoever else he appointed as kings. The only reason they did that was because they were compelled to by virtue of the overwhelming power and the overwhelming force of the French. And this is just this is an axiomatic law of nature. I mean, it transcends geopolitical relations. It's just that if you have power over me, and the only reason I'm subordinating myself to you, once I achieve greater power than you, or once collectively me and my friends get together, we can now kick your ass because, Jeff, you're not as strong as you used to be because you're getting old and you've been out of the gym because of COVID and you're not taking the steroids or whatever, right? And now we can all get together and kick your ass because now you don't have the power, right? It's just about it's a balance of power equation is what it is, right? And the balance of power gets to be to the point where it favors all collective Europe against France, whereas it used to be France and its so-called allies, which are really just puppet states of France and Napoleon's little bitches, right? It used to be all those guys against the rest of Europe, and all those guys, France and its punks, were greater in power than anybody who could possibly challenge them. Well, now the balance of power changes because Napoleon lost so many guys in Russia, and he's not recuperating those losses, and everybody knows it, and Napoleon knows it. And so we have this massive effort on behalf of all the European nations, and they make an agreement amongst themselves, and they say, we will contribute as many available manpower resources and materials and supplies and finances and money as we possibly can in furtherance of ensuring a complete annihilating defeat of Napoleon and his empire once and for all. Okay, now history is going to repeat itself in a few years with the Waterloo campaign, also known as the 100 Days. But right now, let's talk about this the second to last final battle. It's the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations. And in the prelude to this, by the way, this Battle of Leipzig was the French basically versus everybody. Okay, it was everybody else versus the French. Okay, your author talks about the West and the rest. Well, this is Napoleon and the rest, right? Napoleon versus the rest. Okay, and the Battle of Leipzig happened to be the biggest military engagement, the largest in terms of manpower, the largest military engagement in the history of Europe up until this time. There were a total of about 600,000 soldiers on the battlefield at simultaneously. Imagine that, right? And they were all just marching in formation. And imagine what that must have looked like if you were up on a hill and you were seeing that. I mean, the Civil War battles pale in comparison to that. The numerosity, the multiplicity of those numbers, that's absolutely astounding. Now, the prelude to the Battle of Leipzig was something this generalized strategy which the Allies, the coalition, everybody else but France, invoked and abided by was known as the Trachtenberg strategy or the Trachtenberg policy. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing that right. There's no T. There's one T. The Trachtenberg strategy. It's named after some guy, some general who envisioned this. I think he was a Prussian or an Austrian. And the Trachtenberg strategy essentially stipulates that because we, the coalition, we the Allies, right? We the everybody except the French, right? We the guys who are trying to fight and destroy Napoleon. We have overwhelming numerosity. We have overwhelming numerical superiority. We have about collectively the Prussians, the Russians, the Austrians, the German principalities, the British, everybody but France, and then maybe part of Spain that was still ruled by France, and that was about it, right? But everybody else had about 1.6 million soldiers that they could put in the field, right? That were trained, that were equipped, that were fed, right? They weren't starving, they weren't dying of cholera or whatever, right? And they were able to be combat effectives, as the term is known in the vernacular of military tactics. 1.6 million. Whereas the French at this time, Napoleon was down to about 400,000, give or take, right? Probably less than that. Okay, 400,000 versus 1.6 million. So what is that? That's an that's orders of magnitude greater, right? So that's a 3 to 1, roughly a 3.2 to 1 ratio. Okay, right. So we have at least three times as many soldiers as you do, and not only that, but by this time, the soldiers that France was recruiting, incidental to this final confrontation that was about to happen, right? It actually ended up not being the final. It was the second to last confrontation, right? But in this Battle of Leipzig campaign, the soldiers that were being recruited and being brought to bear in the battle by Napoleon were second rate. They were second echelon soldiers because all the first rate soldiers, all the courageous and the young and the virile and the strong, they had all died in Russia, right? Or they died in previous campaigns, okay? Right? So you're left with the second stringers, right? You're left with the bench warmers at this point. And I'm not going to denigrate them by saying, well, they were dishonorable and they were cowardly. No, of course, you had to be a brave man to go into fighting these kinds of battles to begin with, because chances are you're going to be hit by a bullet. There was no anesthetic, right? Or you were speared by a bayonet, or you suffered grievous wounds as a result of being hit by cannonade, grape shot, just these massive like shotgun type things we were going through. So it was a horrible way to die. It was a really painful way to die, and the medical advancements were very rudimentary at that time. So you had to be brave, right? Ipso facto, a priori, if you were fighting in these battles by virtue of just how horrifying they were and just the terrible ramifications they had for you physically in terms of bodily harm and the torturous pain that you suffered, a priori, you had to be a courageous person if you were going to fight in any of these battles, right? So lower quality French soldiers, less French soldiers, large available manpower to the Allies, the coalition against France. And what was the Trachtenberg strategy? It stipulates this: because we have so many soldiers, we could afford to divide them up into multiple armies, and each one of those armies is still going to be big enough to overwhelm Napoleon. And what we're going to do is we're going to come at Napoleon, the French, from different directions, okay? Amassing large bodies of soldiers, large manpower in various constituent armies, and we're going to come at him from many, many different directions. And so what does this require? This requires Napoleon to engage one-on-one with only one of these armies. He can't be everywhere at once. And this is the problem that the armies of the coalitions that preceded this almost final coalition had, is that they tended to consolidate all their forces and all their resources into one big large army, and they hoped they were able to overcome and defeat Napoleon. Well, that was not a very clever, not a very efficacious strategy, because Napoleon was very, very shrewd. He was a very masterful tactician, and he could almost always overcome whatever numerical superiority was arrayed against him by virtue of him being a brilliant general. And so the Trachtenberg strategy says, well, hey, let's not fight Napoleon. Let's engage with his subordinates. Let's force him to divide his forces, to parcelate his forces out, right? And then delegate command over those subordinate forces to his lower echelon generals who are not nearly as competent, not nearly as strategically brilliant as is the great evil mastermind, Napoleon himself. And that was a very good strategy. So we, again, through attrition, right, by defeating these all smaller individual armies that are constituent, subdivisions of the main French army, we're defeating Napoleon's second generals, his lower echelon generals, who are not as clever, not as skilled as he is, and therefore we isolate him and we overwhelm him with the numerical superiority that we have on our sides. And hence, this is the prelude to the Battle of Leipzig. Napoleon ends up losing the Battle of Leipzig, and as a result of his loss, he realizes that he has to surrender to the Allied forces. He has no choice. The Allies are about to invade France, and they are about to restore the Bourbon monarch, right? The successors of Louis XVI, which in fact they do, Louis XVIII, right? Like grandson, like grandfather, okay? And he comes back and he becomes the new ruler of France. And this is inevitable, right? This is a foregone conclusion. But Napoleon doesn't have any choice in this, right? Because he's lost. His final army is destroyed. He's got nowhere to run to, no place to hide, and he surrenders. And he is confined on the island of Elba, okay, which is an island off the coast of Italy. And it's actually not too far from Corsica, where he grew up at. Now it turns out, and the stipulation, the agreement that was made with Napoleon, a way to sort of appease his megalomaniacal propensities. The Allies, the coalition said, okay, you're going to be living on Elba, right? You have to stay there, right? You can't go and try to conquer anything, right? But because we know that you like to be a dictator and you like to be in command of things and you like to be a big boss, we're going to give you sovereign control over the island of Elba, so you can be a king or an emperor unto yourself. It's kind of like those micro states. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this on the news. They have like these micro nations, I think they call them, right? There's this guy out there in Nevada, I think it is, or maybe it's Arizona, and he's got like 3 acres or something in the back of his trailer because he's living. It's a double wide, so it's a nice trailer. But he's got like this uniform. It looks like the uniform of a South African dictator or something. He's got like this hat and all these medals and frills and bullshit, right? And he's got his son and he's got his daughter and he's got his wife, and they're like his ministers or something. Like one's the chief of the police, the other's like the head of the military division or something. And he has declared his 3.5 acres of land in Nevada to be a sovereign nation. Now, of course, he's got like little borders. They have like little signs that say "Welcome to, Jonesboro" or whatever the hell he's named his little nation. But that's kind of what this is reminiscent of, to my mind. It's kind of like a micronation. And Napoleon, of course, is never going to be content with this. This is the man who had such a voracious appetite for conquest. Continental Europe wasn't enough for him, so he had to go and invade Russia, right? He tried to invade Russia because he wanted to get to the Great Britain, right? So you think that an island that is the size of Mackinac Island, and he could be the sovereign overlord of Mackinac Island? That sounds pretty good to me, right? If you said, Jeff, you can be the overlord of Mackinac Island, you can be a king on the Mackinac Island, that's pretty good. But if you said, but you were formerly the sovereign overlord of the entire Midwestern United States, right? You were the overlord over 150 million people, whatever it was, right? So that's a pretty shit deal, okay? I think that's how Napoleon felt. Napoleon escapes from Elba. He lands in France. He is immediately proclaimed emperor by his French, the French people and the French army. The French army that is actually sent out to oppose him is commanded by Marshal Soult, who is one of Napoleon's right-hand men. And even though Marshal Soult is charged by the monarchy, which is the guys who are the successors of Louis XVI, the guys who come in and who are installed by the coalition after Napoleon is relegated to Elba, Marshal Soult is supposed to be going down there and defending the French monarchy. The French was now the Kingdom of France once again from Napoleon. Well, he throws down his saber and he says, "Vive la Empereur, vive la France, vive la Napoleon," and he joins with Napoleon. And they decide, let's go and let's align ourselves and let's consolidate our forces and let's try to conquer Europe once again. Well, that doesn't work out. It ends up in the Battle of Waterloo. There's actually a great movie about this with Rod Steiger plays Napoleon. Actually does a very, very good job. I would never believe this from a guy like Rod Steiger, but he's a phenomenal job. Movie came out in 1970, I think. It was actually made in Russia. It's a big, huge, epic movie. And I shit you guys not. Go out and check it out. It's on YouTube. You can watch it for free if you look for it. It's called Waterloo, okay? And in this movie, they literally have, I think that there was an entire Russian army division, an infantry division, I believe it was. And this was during the Soviet Union, so men and resources, they were a dime a dozen. They were so many guys. They allocated something like 30,000 men for purposes of extras in this movie. So they actually dress these guys up in the regalia and the paraphernalia of the 1800s, right? And they're all carrying these muskets around with them. It's a visual extravaganza. It's not CGI. This is before computer animation. Check it out. It's called Waterloo. It's a movie. I don't really have any more time left, guys, because I went an hour and 53 minutes. I really, I know I keep saying this. I'm going to just owe you guys like an entire week off at this rate, but I got to compensate for not giving you guys breaks, and I haven't given you guys a break, taken into consideration break time in a very long time. So maybe for my purposes as well as for yours, because it's good all around as far as I can see. Next time we'll just go maybe half an hour or something, right? I know I've said that before, and I know I keep on not doing that, but as always, you guys got questions, got issues, think about what I said in the first 10-15 minutes of this video, right? If you forgot, go rewind, go listen to that again, and then let me know what you think, right? Because I really do want to know. I'll hope to talk to you soon, and maybe on the 18th. I don't know. I'll see what you guys say. Have a great week. Have a great weekend. Be safe. Take care all. See you guys next time.